and welcome back to Exhibit Extras, where we give you an in-depth and behind-the-scene look at our exhibits and our exhibit making process. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at 2 large artifacts and 1 large display case. So we're still working with our transportation in Jonesborough exhibit, and so we're going to talk about 2 large artifacts that relate to transportation in the area, and how we decide which one is going to go into the large display case, and give you a little bit of information on the objects themselves. Alright, so our first object is a yoke. Now, it's not an egg yolk, but an animal yoke. And so this would be used to attach animals together and attach them to some means of transportation, be it a wagon or buggy of some sort. So this yoke is about 4.5 feet long, so it's a pretty long object, a little over 1 foot wide. And so there's quite a lot here going on. It is wooden, as you can see here. It's a pretty long piece. It's wooden, kind of heavy, kind of thick, especially necessary because of its purpose. But you also have some iron pieces as well, an iron plate, an iron ring attached directly to it. It is also a double bow, a double ox bow, and that would mean that you could have 2 animals attached with this over the neck to this one yoke. Now there are several different types of yokes and kinds of yokes that would be used. It would be possible to use yoke for horse travel. It would be more common on sort of ox or cattle. By the time that you get to the 19th century, obviously horse and carriage were fairly popular and a lot faster, but things like horse collars made transportation with horse and carriage and horse and buggy a lot easier and a lot better, especially for the animal. There were some bows before the over-the-neck yoke was designed that would go sort of across the chest and was kind of prohibitive for the animal. So this yoke with the bow, whether it's a single or in this case a double bow, can sort of drape over the neck or the back of the animal and then attach via metal pieces and chains and other things. And so you have more flexibility there, and you also have a bit of a better situation for the animal itself. So this, you also saw, not just for transportation, you also saw the use of yokes, especially with ox, for farming and farm equipment and that sort of thing throughout the 19th century. So in our archival database, we don't have any real description about when this is from, so there's no date on it. Judging by the wooden iron, sometime in the 19th century, maybe early 20th century. We also don't know exactly what it would have been used for. It's very possible that it would have been used for farming. It is also possible that it would have been used for some sort of transportation in or around town. We know that Jonesborough has a history of cattle roaming the streets or using cattle to travel around town. Don't know exactly how this one would have been used, but it is a common piece that you would have seen in various forms of transportation, whether it was short distance or whether it was farming. So it fits exactly with our exhibit and our theme, and we have a case that would hold it. So we could put this in the case and have it as part of the exhibit. So that is part of the plan. This was one of the original items that was sort of included in the initial artifact pool for the exhibit. It relates to the horse and carriage part of the exhibit. It relates to the wagon, for the wagon exhibit. We talked about in our first episode with goats pulling wagons. So there are connections to other parts of the exhibit and the items that are on display. But let's go ahead and take a look at our second artifact, and talk about that one for just a minute. All right, so our next object is a carriage jack or a buggy jack. This is a bit larger than the yoke. The main piece here is about 5.5 feet long, so it's about an extra foot long. It's comprised of 3 wooden pieces that are connected with a couple of bolts. You've got the main piece here, you've got this support piece, which is about 2.5 feet long, and then the handle, which is about 3 feet long. So altogether, a much larger, or maybe not a much larger item, but certainly a little bit of a larger item than the yoke. It's very similar composition, so you've got 3 wooden pieces, you've got some iron in the bolts that are connecting, you've got some iron bolts here sort of attached to the main piece. And so this artifact would have been really useful in the 19th century, and it's something that you may be familiar with today. This is a jack, so this is something that would have been used to lift a buggy to assist in the reparation of a broken wheel or to replace a wheel altogether. Now, we don't know much about this specific jack. There are several different styles of buggy jacks from the 19th century. One thing that we are fairly certain about with this item is it's probably missing a couple of components. For example, the support piece here, which is where you would set this piece down. This middle piece here would actually go down on the ground, and then this handle would be used to raise the carriage. This piece, you can see here, is a little bit broken in some spots, so it's possible there was actually a stand that went with it. Not 100% sure. It's possible it just would have come to a flat end and used that way. Another possibility of something that might be missing off of this, several 19th century jacks had connecting pieces to help maintain the tension in the raising of the buggy, and so you would connect the support piece possibly to the pieces doing the lifting or the handle. And if you look here on the support piece, there are a couple of holes. There's one on each side above the connecting bolt that sort of indicates that there was something there that would have connected and possibly tied off here to this main piece. So possible some things are missing, but we know the basic function and how it worked. So you can see this, again, 5.5 feet long, and then this handle comes out to about 3 feet. That's, pretty big. Goes with carriages, right? Carriages are fairly big. We don't know exactly if this would have been used in travel, if it's something that you would have had spare in your carriage. We know that there were several stables and different places in and around Jonesborough where you could get these services done. So it's possible that this would be used more at a stable to help in doing any buggy repairs or in the making of buggies. We also know that if you traveled in the 18th and 19th centuries in large caravans, for example, especially back in the early few years of settlement in Washington County and then even further west, large groups would travel together, and so typically at least one of those large groups, one wagon or one carriage, would have had something like this to assist with any broken wheels. So it's possible this would have just been traveling around in a carriage or a stagecoach or anything like that you would have seen in case of any possible emergency. All right, so we decided to go with the Carriage Jack for our exhibit, and there were a couple of reasons for that. One, it is a little bit of a larger object and takes up a little bit more space inside the case that it's in. The yoke doesn't take up quite as much, it's pretty linear. So this way, with this object, not only is it a little bit bigger, but also is a little bit more dynamic, I guess, for lack of a better word. The way that it arches, for example, it just looks a little bit better aesthetically. It can frame down this way and draw your eye to the label. So we have this large object in the case, and that's the only object in the case. To sort of make up for some of the empty space that's at the bottom, since it's not very wide, it's just kind of big. We did put a stool in to hold our label, so it takes up some of the empty space that is in the case around the object. One of the main reasons why we decided to go with this one, first off, just personal preference, it just looks a little bit more interesting and is a little bit of a more interesting item. But the main reason is when you go to a museum, when you look at an exhibit, we want you to take things away from it, all right? And so with this item, with the yoke, one of the things that you can take away from this item is how heavy it is, right? You pick this up, it's a heavy item, and then you try to imagine, okay, this is just one small piece of an item that's used for transportation, and then you start thinking about how heavy and how large some of these things were. But you can't, you can look at this and think that it's kind of a heavy item, but you don't get that same feeling, that same sense, right? And so part of the appeal of this object is the ability to pick it up and touch it, and that is not an option in this exhibit. The other thing is you can't really relate to, tying this item to something for transportation. For example, we're not still traveling around primarily by horse and carriage and animals. Like, we're not normally hitching things to our vehicles for primary transportation. So that's the appeal for this item, right? So in my hand here, I have an automobile jack, much smaller than this carriage jack. So when you go to this exhibit, and when you see this item, this is something that you might not even be able to guess what it is when you look at it. And so when you look at this item, it's a quick visual, right? We like to think that everyone that comes through here is reading all of our words and all of our labels, and we know that that's probably not the case for most of the people that come through here. If you have ever been in our museum, there is a lot of information to read, and so if you're coming in, if you're taking things in and looking at objects and reading some of the stuff but not all of the things, when you see this item and that the label's pretty short label to look at, then it's a quick visual. It's something you can get quickly, and then you can make the connection quickly. And so this item, when you look at it and you think, okay, this is a carriage jack, okay, this is something that you would use to replace a broken wheel, then immediately you might make the connection of a flat tire that you've had before, or a time that you've had to help someone else change their tire. And then, so you're making a connection. And then you start thinking, well, maybe you haven't even thought of the fact that people had to change their tires on wagons and carriages when they were traveling, or what that process would have been like. So you're relating a couple of things just to this item, or we're hoping that this item is going to make a couple of direct connections for you. One, between this object and an object that you are familiar with. So this object, the sort of thing that you take from it isn't necessarily the heaviness, it's the size when you compare this to an object that you have here. Now, you're probably not traveling through an exhibit carrying around a car jack with you, unless you're just very, very prepared. But you know what this is. You can recall it in your memory. Every new car that you get has one of these sort of shoved in the trunk underneath the spare tire. So you know, like, you don't have to carry this around. You don't have to feel these things. You can see it and make that connection. The other connection that we hope that you make when you see this item is a connection to people who lived in the past, right? We've all had flat tires, or know somebody that's had a flat tire, or an emergency situation like that. And it's, the feeling that maybe it's a scary, maybe it's frustration. It always happens at the worst possible time. And then you can recognize, oh, hey, they did that too in the 19th century and 18th century and so forth. And so they had to go through that same thing too. And so it gives you a sense of relatability to people who lived in the past just by looking at an object. At least that's what we hope anyway. So that's it for this episode. Thank you again for tuning in. For more behind the scenes look at our exhibits and our exhibit making process, follow along with us on this series and catch us on the next one. Thanks. Bye.